For 30 years Gabe Brown carried a secret buried deeper than the Alaskan frost that shaped his entire life. He smiled for the cameras, built cabins with his bare hands, and stood as the loyal, dependable son of the wilderness. But behind that strength and silence, another life was quietly unfolding, patient, hidden, and waiting for the moment it could no longer stay concealed. The secret in the snow. The truth didn't explode in scandal or loud arguments. It emerged quietly during the final weeks of winter in 2025, when the air around the Brown homestead felt heavier than usual and the mountains stood rigid beneath a brittle sky. Inside that heavy silence, something fragile had already started to crack, though no one yet realized how deep the fracture ran. Gabe Brown had always been the steady one, the son who seemed carved from the same timber he hauled across frozen ground. The man who rarely questioned the path in front of him and rarely let doubt rise to the surface. On Alaskan Bush People he appeared completely unwavering, devoted to family, devoted to survival, devoted to the rugged life that millions believed defined him fully and without exception. But devotion can hide cracks, and cracks grow wider when no one looks closely enough to see them forming. The change began with a conversation never meant to be overheard. A late-night exchange spoken in low voices that slipped through cabin walls and reached someone who hadn't intended to listen. Gabe's tone wasn't angry or rebellious, it was exhausted in a way that unsettled the listener, who froze in the darkness and realized something fundamental was shifting. "I can't keep pretending," he admitted, and the word "pretending" hung in the cold air like visible breath that couldn't be pulled back once released. By morning the house felt subtly but unmistakably different. Eye contact shortened, small talk reduced to the bare minimum. No announcement was made. No explanation was offered, yet a current of unease moved between siblings who had survived illness, relocation, and loss without ever breaking apart publicly. They believed they knew one another completely because survival had demanded transparency, unity, and trust as their foundation. What they didn't yet understand was that survival had also required silence. And silence can shape a person just as powerfully as hardship. For 30 years, stretching back to boyhood, before the cameras and before the fame, Gabe had quietly cultivated an internal life that didn't match the version he showed his family or the audience. It wasn't another household or a dramatic hidden identity, it was a parallel existence of doubts, questions, and long-suppressed truths that had never found space to breathe. The wilderness demanded strength, obedience to nature, and obedience to expectation, leaving little room for hesitation and even less for self-examination. Gabe became what was needed, molding himself into the dependable son while quietly shaping a second self that asked questions no one around him dared to voice. That second self waited patiently, growing stronger with every year of restraint and every moment of unspoken conflict. Now, in the stillness of winter, restraint had finally reached its limit, and the brother they thought they knew completely was standing before them with unfamiliar depth in his eyes, preparing to reveal something that would change the family story they had all helped create. The son who stayed to understand how Gabe Brown managed to live a double life for 30 years. You have to understand the role he played so convincingly that no one ever thought to question it. In a family forged by isolation, faith, and relentless survival, roles weren't casually chosen, they were absorbed early and carried without visible complaint. Gabe absorbed his completely, and wore it like a second skin. Among the Brown siblings he was never the loudest voice in the room or the one openly testing boundaries. He rarely positioned himself as the rebel seeking distance, while others occasionally pushed against structure or explored independence in visible ways. Gabe leaned inward, deeper into the rhythm of wilderness living that defined them both privately and publicly. On Alaskan Bush People, he appeared grounded, loyal, and unshakably committed to the family narrative. Viewers saw him hauling logs across snow, learning hard lessons beside his father, and standing shoulder to shoulder with his brothers. When weather or circumstance threatened to break their resolve, he offered steady support when illness shadowed the household and when public criticism pressed in from beyond the tree line. He rarely displayed resentment, rarely showed confusion, and almost never allowed doubt to rise where cameras might capture it. That steadiness became his identity over time, and identity, when reinforced long enough, begins to feel immovable. Yet steadiness, when constantly expected, can quietly turn into performance, especially when the person carrying it starts feeling divided inside. From childhood, Gabe learned which qualities earned approval and which were better left unexpressed within a system built on unity. Strength was admired openly. Obedience was praised consistently. Resilience was treated as proof of character and devotion. Emotional complexity, uncertainty, or disagreement were harder to voice in a structure that depended on harmony for survival. So he learned to filter himself carefully. When cameras entered their lives and the family story expanded into millions of homes, that filtering sharpened into instinct. Gabe understood how to present calm during conflict and certainty during chaos, even when certainty didn't exist inside him. He replaced questions with action and hesitation with effort, believing productivity could quiet the internal friction he was beginning to feel. The double life didn't begin with deliberate deception. It began with steady suppression of parts of himself that didn't fit the established mold. As the years moved through the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, the Browns endured relocation, grief, and the shifting dynamics that follow profound loss. Those changes reshaped the family balance and subtly altered the authority structure that had once defined every decision. In that altered landscape, Gabe found himself confronting thoughts he had once dismissed as fleeting or disloyal. He began to question whether the path he walked had ever been consciously chosen, and whether survival might require more than physical endurance alone. These reflections didn't explode outward. They lingered in quiet moments after work was done and conversations ended. He didn't reject the wilderness or resent the upbringing that shaped him. Yet he sensed that expectation had guided more of his life than authentic desire. That realization brought guilt rather than clarity, because questioning the structure felt dangerously close to questioning the people he loved most. He feared that voicing doubt would fracture the unity that had protected them through hardship. Through 2023 and into 2024, subtle changes began appearing that few recognized as significant. He sought more solitude, engaged in conversations beyond the narrow framework he had always known, and explored perspectives that challenged long-held assumptions. To some it looked like distraction or moodiness, but internally it was a gradual awakening. For 30 years Gabe had aligned himself with expectations so completely that distinguishing authenticity from adaptation became nearly impossible. The double life wasn't rooted in scandal or betrayal. It was rooted in a widening split between the dependable son who stayed and the individual quietly searching for his own definition. By the time winter approached in 2025, the weight of maintaining both identities had become unsustainable, and the cost of silence began to exceed the fear of truth. The second world, the second life Gabe Brown lived was never built on lies spoken aloud, but on truths withheld so consistently that even he began to lose track of where performance ended and authenticity began. For 30 years he constructed an internal refuge where questions could exist without judgment and doubts could surface without threatening the unity that defined his family. That refuge became his quiet sanctuary, though it also became the dividing line between who he was and who he appeared to be. In the wilderness culture that shaped him, endurance was proof of strength, and silence was often mistaken for stability. Gabe learned early that voicing confusion created ripple effects, and ripple effects in a survival-driven household could feel dangerous. So instead of speaking, he listened, absorbed, and adjusted, slowly creating a version of himself that moved smoothly within expectation while another version observed from deeper within. As the years progressed and the public identity of the Brown family expanded, that internal split widened almost imperceptibly. Fame brought scrutiny, and scrutiny reinforced the need for composure, which only strengthened his instinct to compartmentalize. He told himself that protecting the family image required sacrifice, and he believed that sacrifice included setting aside his own evolving perspective. By early 2024, the pressure of that compartmentalization had begun manifesting physically and emotionally in ways he could no longer dismiss. restless nights became frequent, his thoughts cycling long after the cabin lights dimmed, and a persistent tightness settled in his chest that no amount of outdoor labor seemed to relieve. The body, unlike the persona, refused to cooperate indefinitely. It was during that period that Gabe quietly made a decision he had once considered unnecessary and perhaps even forbidden within his own belief system. He began seeking professional guidance, not for dramatic crisis, but because he sensed something foundational was misaligned inside him. The choice felt both small and monumental, as though he were stepping across an invisible boundary drawn decades earlier. In one early session he was asked a question that lingered far longer than he expected. The therapist didn't ask about television or survival or public pressure, but instead asked who he believed himself to be when no one was watching and no expectations were pressing in. Gabe realized he didn't have a clear answer, and that absence unsettled him more than any physical hardship he had ever endured. For the first time he began tracing the origin of his internal split back through childhood memories and formative years before the cameras ever arrived. He remembered moments when he felt different but chose alignment over expression, believing unity was more valuable than individuality. Those small decisions, repeated over decades, had built the second world he now inhabited quietly. As therapy continued through mid-2024 he began articulating thoughts he had never spoken aloud, even to himself. He admitted uncertainty about certain long-held beliefs, questioned whether his path had been freely chosen, and acknowledged that parts of his identity had remained underdeveloped because they didn't align with expectation. Saying those words felt both disloyal and liberating. The more he examined his internal landscape, the clearer it became that he had never intended to deceive anyone. He had simply survived within a system that rewarded conformity and strength while leaving little room for exploration of complexity. His double life wasn't malicious. It was adaptive, built layer by layer in response to environment. Outside the therapy room, subtle shifts began appearing in his behavior, though he tried to minimize their impact. He set small boundaries where none had existed before, declined certain obligations, and allowed himself pauses where he once would have filled silence with action. To some family members these changes seemed puzzling and even concerning. One evening during a quiet conversation that felt heavier than most, a sibling asked him directly what was happening beneath the surface. Gabe hesitated, aware that words once spoken could not be retracted, and admitted he was re-examining parts of himself he had ignored for years. The admission didn't ignite immediate conflict, but it planted unease. Through late 2024 the tension remained subtle but persistent, like distant thunder that never quite reached the valley floor. Gabe found himself standing between two identities more consciously than ever before, no longer able to pretend the split didn't exist. The refuge he had built internally was no longer enough. By early 2025 the effort required to maintain both versions of himself had grown exhausting beyond measure. He could feel the strain in conversations, in family gatherings, and in his own reflection when he allowed honesty to surface. The second world he had cultivated for 30 years was no longer content to remain hidden, when he finally acknowledged to himself that he could not continue living divided. The realization wasn't explosive, but profoundly steady. He understood that revealing the truth would disrupt the balance his family depended upon, yet he also recognized that continued silence would slowly erode him from within. The cost of authenticity frightened him, but the cost of suppression had become unbearable. The double life was nearing its end, not because it had been discovered dramatically, but because Gabe could no longer sustain the separation between public devotion and private awakening. What had once protected him now confined him, and the moment of convergence was approaching with quiet inevitability. The breaking point, the unraveling, didn't come through shouting or shattered doors, but through a moment that felt frighteningly physical and impossible to dismiss. Arriving in late 2024 after months of quiet therapy and private emotional excavation, Gabe had been carrying tension like a second spine, invisible but rigid, and one evening his body refused to cooperate with the illusion of control he had maintained for decades. What began as tightness in his chest quickly spiraled into racing thoughts and shallow breath until even he could no longer convince himself it was just exhaustion. For a man raised to equate strength with endurance, the loss of internal control felt more terrifying than any wilderness storm he had survived. He was taken to the hospital, not because his life hung in immediate danger, but because the symptoms were intense enough to alarm those who saw the change in his face. Beneath sterile lights and the hum of quiet machines, Gabe confronted a truth he had postponed for years. Suppression accumulates interest, and the body eventually collects. The doctors spoke calmly about stress responses and anxiety overload, explaining that emotional strain can manifest physically when left unaddressed. Their language felt foreign in a family accustomed to measuring hardship by visible labor and tangible scars rather than invisible fractures. That night became the pivot around which everything else would turn, because for the first time there was evidence that his internal struggle could no longer remain abstract. When he returned home, the air inside the cabin felt different from the earlier tension that had lingered quietly, because now concern replaced confusion. The family gathered, unsure whether to approach the situation as a medical incident or as the consequence of something deeper. Gabe could see fear in their expressions, and that fear forced him to confront what he had avoided saying aloud. When asked gently what had triggered the episode, he hesitated only briefly before admitting that pretending certainty for years had finally become too heavy to carry. He explained that therapy had uncovered patterns stretching back to childhood, revealing how often he had chosen alignment over authenticity to protect unity. He clarified that no one had explicitly demanded his silence, yet he had internalized expectations so completely that he censored himself instinctively. The confession didn't explode into anger, but it landed heavily, altering the atmosphere in a way no one could ignore. One sibling asked quietly why he hadn't trusted them enough to speak sooner, and the question carried hurt rather than accusation. Gabe responded that he hadn't trusted himself to articulate what he felt, because he feared that once voiced his doubts would fracture the foundation they depended on. He admitted that he had loved them fiercely throughout every season of their lives, yet love had also made him afraid of disappointing them. The vulnerability in his voice unsettled those who had long seen him as the most stable among them. Another family member suggested that it felt as though he had been acting for years, and the word acting cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Gabe resisted the impulse to retreat and instead clarified that he had never fabricated loyalty or affection, but he had minimized parts of himself to preserve harmony. He explained that the double life wasn't built on lies, but on compartmentalization that slowly became unsustainable. Silence had once felt protective, yet over time it became confining. As days passed, the emotional aftershocks rippled outward in subtle but undeniable ways. Some siblings withdrew temporarily, needing space to process emotions that didn't yet have language. Others attempted reassurance, reminding him that personal growth didn't automatically equal abandonment of family loyalty. Yet beneath those reassurances lingered uncertainty about what his transformation meant for the collective future they had always imagined. The most painful moment came when someone asked whether they had ever truly known him, and the question echoed longer than any argument might have. Gabe answered carefully that they had known the version of him he felt safe expressing at the time, but not the entirety of who he was becoming. He acknowledged that this realization hurt him as well, because it meant he had lived partially, even among those he trusted most. The admission marked a turning point from avoidance toward uncomfortable honesty. Through early 2025, conversations continued with uneven rhythm, sometimes steady and sometimes strained. Gabe remained consistent in therapy and began setting clearer boundaries, explaining that protecting his mental health wasn't a rejection of family, but an act of responsibility. He expressed fear of losing connection, yet admitted he feared losing himself even more. The breaking point hadn't destroyed the Brown family, but it had cracked open a truth long sealed beneath resilience, revealing that strength without authenticity eventually collapses under its own weight. Fallout in the family. The days following Gabe's confession didn't erupt into shouting or dramatic ultimatums, but they carried a quiet recalibration that unsettled everyone in ways no one openly admitted at first. the Brown family had always relied on rhythm and predictability, on knowing instinctively how each member would respond when pressure mounted. And now that rhythm felt fractured in subtle but unmistakable ways. Love hadn't disappeared. Yet certainty had, and certainty had always been the invisible glue holding their structure together. Conversations became measured and deliberate, as though each sentence required careful construction to avoid unintended harm. Ordinary routines, shared meals and project discussions, felt slightly altered because beneath every exchange lingered the awareness that something foundational had shifted. Gabe sensed hesitation in lingering glances and shortened replies, and he understood that trust, once unquestioned, was now being quietly examined. Some siblings retreated into reflection rather than confrontation, choosing solitude to process emotions that didn't yet have language. Others attempted to bridge the widening emotional space with reassurance, reminding him that personal growth didn't automatically equal abandonment of family loyalty. Beneath those reassurances, however, lay an unspoken fear that the family identity might not survive this level of individual transformation. In private moments, memories were revisited and reinterpreted through the lens of his admission, with small behaviors from the past taking on new significance. A thoughtful pause during a decision, a rare moment of quiet withdrawal, or an uncharacteristic hesitation, were now viewed differently, as though clues had been present all along without anyone recognizing their meaning. The realization that the split had existed for decades left some feeling unsettled by how much they had missed. One evening, beneath a sky so clear it felt almost fragile, a sibling voiced what others had been circling cautiously. They admitted that Gabe's honesty had forced them to examine their own compromises, their own instances of adaptation that had gone unspoken in the name of unity. That admission shifted the tone of the conversation from subtle accusation to shared introspection. Gabe listened carefully as others acknowledged that silence had been a survival tool for more than one person in the household. He recognized that his double life wasn't entirely isolated, but part of a broader pattern shaped by expectation and the desire to protect collective stability. The shift didn't erase the hurt, but it reframed it in a way that allowed empathy to surface gradually. Long conversations followed in the weeks that came after, stretching late into the night without clear resolution, but with increasing honesty. They discussed what unity might look like if it allowed for difference rather than demanded uniformity, and they confronted the uncomfortable idea that strength didn't require suppression. These exchanges weren't easy, but they felt necessary. Gabe didn't ask for immediate forgiveness or complete understanding, because he recognized that trust rebuilds through consistency rather than declarations. He continued showing up for responsibilities while maintaining boundaries he had begun establishing in recent months, demonstrating that authenticity didn't equate to withdrawal from shared commitment. His actions slowly reinforced that he wasn't abandoning the family structure. Gradually, small gestures of normalcy returned, shared laughter emerging more naturally and tension easing from everyday interactions. The initial shock softened into cautious acceptance, and acceptance began transforming into a more nuanced connection built on awareness rather than assumption. The family dynamic didn't revert to its previous form, but it adapted. By early spring 2025, the Browns were operating under a different understanding of one another. They no longer assumed complete knowledge of each other's internal landscapes, and that humility created space for continued honesty. Gabe felt exposed yet lighter, aware that vulnerability had disrupted comfort but clarified connection. The fallout hadn't shattered the foundation they had built together, but it had reshaped it into something less rigid and more conscious. The man he finally became. 30 years is a long time to live divided. And when that division finally collapses, what remains can feel unfamiliar even to the person who endured it. For Gabe Brown, the months following the fallout weren't about dramatic reinvention or public declarations, but about integration, which proved far more demanding than simply walking away ever could have been. He had to learn how to exist without filtering every instinct through the question of whether it would preserve harmony. He didn't abandon the wilderness, nor did he reject the values that shaped his upbringing, because those elements were never the true source of his fracture. What he released was the belief that loyalty required self-erasure, and that strength demanded silence whenever conflict stirred internally. That distinction was subtle, yet it altered the foundation of how he understood himself and his place within the family. Therapy continued steadily through mid-2025. Not as crisis response but as reconstruction of identity that had been deferred for decades. In those sessions he practiced speaking without pre-editing his thoughts to align automatically with expectation, allowing himself to explore uncertainty without labeling it disloyal. Over time that practice began carrying into everyday life at home. Conversations that once triggered reflexive agreement now paused long enough for authenticity to enter. Even if authenticity complicated the moment that he found himself expressing preferences he previously would have suppressed and admitting hesitation where he once projected confidence, the change wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable to those who paid attention. The family noticed the difference gradually, because Gabe didn't transform into someone unrecognizable, but into someone more transparent. He remained dependable during shared responsibilities and present in collective decisions, yet his presence felt grounded rather than performative. Where he once absorbed tension silently he now addressed it calmly and directly. One afternoon during a routine discussion about long-term plans a sibling observed that he seemed lighter than he had in years, and the comment carried genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Gabe responded without humor or deflection, explaining that the weight of pretending certainty had lifted, and that vulnerability, though uncomfortable, required less energy than constant performance. That exchange marked a quiet turning point in how he was perceived within the family structure. The steady son who had once seemed unshakable was no longer defined solely by endurance, but by self-awareness and willingness to engage openly. Strength was no longer measured by silence, but by clarity. The Browns in turn began adapting to this version of him, recognizing that his evolution didn't threaten the foundation of their bond. They discovered that unity built on transparency felt more resilient than unity maintained through unspoken compromise. It required adjustment, but it also fostered a depth of understanding that hadn't existed before. Gabe confronted lingering guilt that surfaced unexpectedly when old habits tempted him toward suppression for the sake of convenience. He had to remind himself repeatedly that authenticity wasn't selfishness, and that expressing doubt didn't equate to abandoning responsibility. The internal dialogue that once operated silently now unfolded consciously, and with consciousness came choice. As summer approached in 2025 the atmosphere within the household felt markedly different from the winter that had exposed everything. Conversations flowed more freely, and disagreements no longer carried the same undercurrent of fear that someone's identity might fracture beneath them. The double life that had once defined him quietly had dissolved into a singular narrative. He remained shaped by the wilderness and by years of shared hardship, yet he no longer viewed those experiences as constraints. Instead he understood them as formative chapters that informed him without confining him. The internal refuge he had built for protection was no longer separate from his public self, because the two had finally merged. In a quiet moment beneath an open sky Gabe reflected on how easily he could have continued the split indefinitely. He recognized that the cost would have been gradual erosion rather than dramatic collapse, and that erosion often goes unnoticed until almost nothing remains intact. Choosing honesty had felt destabilizing, but it prevented that slow unraveling. When a sibling later asked whether he regretted waiting so long to speak openly he answered with thoughtful clarity rather than defensiveness. He admitted that he wished he had trusted himself sooner, yet he also acknowledged that readiness cannot be forced, and that growth unfolds according to timing shaped by experience. The 30 years he spent divided were not erased, but transformed into understanding. The man he had finally become was not radically different from the son who had once stayed without question, yet he was undeniably more whole. He carried the same loyalty, the same work ethic, and the same commitment to family, but now those qualities coexisted with autonomy rather than replacing it. Survival and authenticity no longer stood in opposition. And the wilderness outside him no longer felt as vast as the one he had finally navigated within. Gabe Brown's greatest battle was never against the wilderness, but against the silence he carried within it. His story reminds us that strength without honesty eventually fractures. If this revelation moved you, share your thoughts below and tell us whether you believe the Browns will ever be the same again.